that's a white fragility moment right there, where I was like, this lovely person just shattered me for a moment. And I had to quickly kind of think, well, what did they mean by that? And why would they say that? And do my own internal reflection. Problem is, not everyone can do that. And so, like you said, white lady tears are definitely a thing. Everybody makes jokes about it, and and I've seen white men tears. So white tears are a problem. And so my advice is always to myself and to everyone else is that when people challenge us for saying or perpetuating racist ideas, we have to own it.
I'm Evolve Benton. My pronouns are they or king. I'm an educational consultant, healer, and I am from Los Angeles, heart through and through, but I live in Atlanta, Georgia.
My name's Jefferson Darrell. I am the founder and CEO of a boutique workplace culture consultancy called Breakfast Culture. breakfastculture.ca. My pronouns are he, him, and I'm also on the 2S LGBTQ+ spectrum, so you can also use queen as a pronoun for me as well.
Hi, my name is Scott Dagostino. My pronouns are he, him, and I am a former journalist with Extra and Fab magazine in Toronto, Ontario, and I am the former manager of Glad Day Bookshop, the world's oldest LGBTQIA+ bookshop, founded in 1970. I became the manager in 2012 and shepherded through many years until it evolved into a restaurant, cafe, bookshop at the corner of Church and Wellesley in the heart of downtown Toronto. It's a beautiful space. I urge everyone to check it out online or in person. And I have been spending the last couple of years working with Jefferson at Breakfast Culture as a Jedi consultant.
And my name is Curious Ben, or Ben the Curious, pronouns he, him. My wife and I make up Ben and Jamisa, and we work with individuals and organizations helping them lead with humanity. And my background comes from about 20 years in forensic counseling, working with domestic violence and sexual violence, and recognizing that the type of sociopathy driving those behaviors is very present in our workplaces. And so working to combat that.
Scott, if you'd like to chat a little bit about your thoughts about what white privilege is and how it's connected to white fragility and racism.
Oh, in 30 seconds or less. Okay.
Well, so yourself, we're going to.
Well, it's funny. You talk about the Gay Pride parade and the protest for Black Lives Matter during that parade as being a catalyst point. And it kind of was for me too, because, this is, I've talked to a lot of white people, who've sort of said like, all this race relations stuff, it's depressing. I feel judged. I don't even know where to start. Like they see it as some like, gigantic university course or something, and of course, sometimes it can be, but I keep saying like a lot of it is just opening your eyes to the world around you and looking at what the people in your neighborhood are going through. That's really all it is, and it's like, so I guess my own journey was in such like, when I first took over Glad Day, I was coming in as a cisgendered white gay man, running a bookshop for a very broad community of queer people, right? So I had, of course, Black friends and trans friends and non-binary friends and lesbian friends, and all of whom are dear to me. But it wasn't until I was in a position where, as a community leader, I had to really be accountable for the first time to a broad group of people. And the accountability is, I think, what's very new and very scary for a lot of white people. Because suddenly it's like, you don't just get to shoot your mouth off about stuff. You have to sort of, back up what you say. So very quickly, I was put in a very kind of big learning curve, especially around trans issues. This was back in like 2011. And so I think what I rapidly began to realize was that for white gay men my age, and for a lot of lesbians too, although not as much, the civil rights things that we fought for since Stonewall had been working. Gay people are part of the fabric of the world. We are on television. We are part of the culture. We have politicians who could argue for us. Our counselor in Toronto at the time was a gay man named Kyle Ray, who was very loud on our behalf. So essentially, white gay guys were doing okay. Not great, but good. But I realized that everyone else, not so much. And this is kind of, what I call the sort of trickle-down economics of culture, where it's not just about the money. It's this idea that it's like, well, first we'll take care of the white men, And then those benefits will sort of trickle down to everybody else. And that's kind of how it's gone, and it's kind of gruesome. So I realized early on that my part in all this was to say, like, okay, me and my friends, the white gay guys, we're good. We need to focus on other people. So years later, and during this, I made a focus of really trying to help like non-binary kids and trans people. I was very loud, very, very, as much of an advocate as I could be. But then the Black Lives Matter protests started. And what was really interesting was just the slogan, Black Lives Matter, as a response to the police killings all through America. Horror stories. Every week you'd pick up a paper and read a story about Trayvon Martin or Tamir Rice or horror stories. And so Black Lives Matter was just a simple statement. And I saw that and nodded and said, "You're sure?" And then came the backlash, because there's always a backlash. And suddenly I'm seeing a backlash to what to me is a perfectly obvious statement. And then it became like, well, what about all lives? Don't all lives matter? No, and people use the analogy of going to the doctor for a broken bone and say, doctor, my arm is broken. And having the doctor say, well, all bones matter. No, we're focusing on the arm today. So this is, to me, this was all very natural. And so that fateful gay pride Sunday, when the parade was happening, a group of Black lesbians stopped the parade dead in its tracks and set off big, colorful smoke bombs and sat down on the pavement on Yonge Street in Toronto in the very heart of downtown and said, we're stopping this parade until you recognize that Black people need a better voice in Pride Toronto. And this is what Pride does. There's always a protest about something. I covered for Extra. In 2010, there was a series of protests by a group called Queers Against Israeli Apartheid. Their statement was very clear. They regarded what was going on in Israel and the occupation as an apartheid system. They were speaking out. But again, the level of backlash towards them was unbelievable. Pride almost lost its funding. So this wasn't a new thing. There's always something going on at Pride that makes somebody mad, somebody in power mad, I should say. But the reaction that Jefferson talked about of older white gay guys, many of whom had, there was one who was like a human rights lawyer in Toronto, very rich, very well known, very successful gay man. Everyone looked up to him as a community leader. And he just went on a full-on racist tirade. Like Jefferson said, well, how could they come to our parade and do this to us? And the language was fascinating. And I had so many arguments in the shop because here I am in my humble little bookshop with people coming in, literally yelling in my face about how angry they are at those people who did this to our parade. And I had to just kind of walk everybody off the ledge one by one to say, like, it's not our parade. It's everyone's parade. It's their parade too. And in trying to sort of do my best to sort of draw the community and heal the community together. But white privilege is a thing, and it's real. And I've had my own journey into sort of recognizing that. When I first heard the word privilege, I'm a working class kid from Hamilton, Ontario. It's a steel town. I grew up poor. I don't have privilege. So to have people come to me and go, "Oh, with your white privilege," this was a completely alien concept to me. And that took a while to get over. But you do come to see that it's like, we have our privileges. And so it's a learning curve that I think everybody has to go on. It's one that I've gone on. My hope is to make it look as easy as I can so I can bring other white people with me to say, like, hey, we can do this and not just be privileged jerks all the time. And Ben has done amazing work in that regard, and I'll pass the torch.
Scott, real quick question for you. I know you said that, you've been on the journey, you've kind of done some of the labor around it, here on
just
the show.
Not young, but yeah. Didn't mean to imply that.
Yeah, but here on the show, we try to talk about education. So what are some of the steps that, because you said I grew up poor, I'm in this still town. For me, I'm not privileged, right? But then you had this reality that you were. What are some of the steps that you've taken for yourself personally to reflect and have that understanding? I think that could be really helpful for the audience.
Well, I mean, the main two things, it's always about community. It's always about talking to people. I can resist a lot of racist crap in the culture because of wonderful people like Jefferson, who I know, who will set me straight. The minute I start saying something racist or stupid, I've got black friends around me to be like, dude, that's not how that works. And people can like put me on the right path, right? So that, and not just black people, but everyone. I have trans friends and non-binary friends who do the same thing. I'll slip on pronouns and they'll be like, hey, watch those pronouns. And I'm like, you are correct. And it's interesting, again, we talk about backlashes. I see people now, they're just furious about pronouns. And I'm like, it's literally the easiest and simplest form of respect to sort of honor somebody in like, I've had friends, a friend came to me once and sat down and said, I'm on a gender journey and I would now like to be called Maya. And I was like, all right, Maya it is. And, it was difficult because this was someone I'd known for like 15 years. So obviously it's not easy to stop using their previous name, but you do it. You do it for your friends. You do it for your community. And so there's that. And then secondly, books, running a bookshop. I mean, I'm a lucky man. I had access to, the greatest minds on earth. And so I read people like Larry Duplishin, Audre Lorde, I did the reading, so, I was lucky to take university courses where they made us read, Ralph Ellison and Zora Neale Hurston and all the greats, and it's like, I have read so many great black authors. It's hard to be racist when you're surrounded by this kind of genius and black excellence. So I always tell people, I'm like, just read a damn book, like pick up, there's amazing people out there. It's like, it's like,
I love that. Just read a damn book.
Just read a damn book. That's, at the end of the day, like it's for everything. I mean, like I met Kate Bornstein years ago, and Kate Bornstein was one of the earliest writers on gender. She's a trans woman who's old and wonderful, she's just a great pillar of the community, and she's gone through stuff. And when you read Kate, you're like, oh, Julia Serrano is another one, a trans woman who has written really eloquently. She has a book called Excluded, which I recommend for everybody. So if you're struggling with, cisgendered people who are struggling with, what trans and non-binary means, I'm like, just read some Julia Serrano. That's one start. It's a simple thing. One book.
Thank you very much, Scott, and thank you for that question, Evolve. I think we're going to continue that part of the discussion in a moment. Curious Ben would love to hear from you. A little background, people. I just started following and saw Curious Ben would pop up in my feed on Instagram. And no offense, Mr. Curious Ben, I'd be like, who's this white dude talking about racism? What's going on? His name's Curious. I'm like, let me take a look. So I was curious. And I was like, oh, damn. He is spilling some good tea. Okay. Maybe that's a fluke. Oh, damn. This is another good one. Whoa. This man is an ally. Is not sugarcoating. Is not. Wow. And I reached out to him. Actually, I spoke to Evolve first. And Bob and I were like, well, let's just check him out and see what's going on. And we reached out and thought, let's invite Curious Ben to our podcast. So welcome. If you'd like to have we'd love to hear a little bit about your background and a little bit about your own experience, especially as it relates to white privilege and racism.
Sure. And kind of like Scott said, it's such a huge topic, right? Like I'll do my best to kind of sum it up in a few seconds. So I think it all kind of started for me back in college. I was studying African American history. I was studying history of the Holocaust. I was studying history of oppression in general. And I was just fascinated by this idea of kind of sociopathy and how people can just function without concern for how their behaviors impact other people. And so my career continued. I ended up kind of serendipitously working in domestic violence and sexual violence and spent some time in prisons and just working with formerly diagnosed sociopaths. And I found them so boring. I found them just lacking, like we give them so much attention in our society and we make them out to be these like thrilling, fascinating people. And they lack any type of humanity. The only time they seem to feel emotion is when they are winning, is the word you'll hear a lot. It's the only thing that seems to bring them any kind of joy. And winning can be sending Jefferson to the wrong meeting at the wrong time so he looks silly. And winning can mean kidnapping someone and torturing them at a more on the sadomasochistic end, sociopathy. And so I started working with sexual violence offenders, started working with domestic violence offenders, started really understanding sociopathy in action. And I started looking more and more at whiteness. And I was like, oh, hell. Like, if this was a Venn diagram, it would be a circle. Like, there's no real separation. Like, as white people, we are bred with these sociopathic traits. And everything that we're kind of raised in is about competitiveness versus cooperation. Mm-hmm. It's this sense of like, well, sorry, Scott, that you didn't get that, but at least I got ahead. And maybe you should try harder next time. Mm-hmm. And so there was the overlap between the two was so glaring to me that I just started asking other white people, like, man, are we a bunch of sociopaths? And obviously the response is like, of course not, Ben. We're amazing. We're wonderful. And I noticed that white people do the same thing sociopaths do, which is they will label themselves as good people and then use that title as reason to oppress others. So because I'm such a caring person towards women, I'm going to limit their freedoms and make decisions for them out of sheer goodness towards them. And you see this pattern over and over and over again of how white people just don't seem to give a shit about how their behaviors impact other people. I think it's funny to look at like white pride versus black pride. And like black pride is so joyful and is so interconnected with other cultures and other identities. And it's like raising everybody up. But we all know white pride is the complete opposite. It's about violence. It's about oppression. And so I think a very simple question for people to ask is, why is that? Why is pride in one culture? Why does it look so different or in one race than pride in another? And I think it starts to open you up to this idea of what whiteness is. And I know there's going to be a bunch of people out there who are like, not all white people. I'm so tired of all that. Like, yeah, okay. So maybe not all white people, but whiteness. And there's obviously non-white people who participate in whiteness too, who think that it's going to help protect them or raise them up. And so I think we can get around the whole not all white people thing, because there's probably people listening right now who are like, not all white people or not all men or whatever it is. And just say, okay, whiteness. Let's talk about whiteness and how you participate in it.
Yeah. Scott touched on that with Black Lives Matter versus All Lives Matter. Comes to that. So thank you both for an incredible introduction.
Can I just quickly jump on that one?
Sure.
Yeah, I was going to say, this is one of the things I talked about in the White Privilege Diaries, where, you know, an eye-opener for me years ago was realizing that because I've had so many people come to me and they're like, well, if you can have black pride and if you can have white or black power, then why can't we have white pride? Why can't we have white power? And it's like you said, when I hear people say black power, I think, you know, yeah, that's uplift. They want to, you know, uplift and be stronger and lead. And, you know, like Obama as president was a display of black power. I'm like, yeah, I trust black power. I do not trust white power. Because when they say white power, I, as a white man, get scared. Their white power is something like threatening, you know. And I said, and the epiphany that I had was realizing years ago as I started going on my own little journey of getting in touch with my family background. And, you know, our family's kind of just like sort of an Irish, Scottish stew, right? But, you know, mostly Irish. And I realized that like my family had come over here after the famine, you know, typical story of the refugees who came to Canada. So I've always had, you know, a soft spot for immigrants because like I was adopted by an Italian man. That's why D'Agostino is my last name. He was an immigrant who came here. He drove taxis in Canada. You know, immigrants built North America. America and Canada would be nothing without their immigrants. And being a part of that Irish history for me was very empowering and very enlightening and very uplifting. And I love, the more I learned about Irish culture, the more I fell in love with it. And I was like, to not know my own Irish culture because I was perceived as white is actually a theft from me. Whiteness harms everyone. It's not just like used as a stick to beat people of color. It also strips away everything that makes our individual cultures unique. I have Scandinavian friends. I have Polish friends. I have Italian friends. These are all fascinating cultures, but all of them just get smooshed into whiteness. And that was one of the things I wrote about. And so Ben, when you say like there's a sociopathic quality to it, it's like, yeah, it becomes this nature versus nurture. I don't think white people are inherently sociopathic. Sorry, I'm going to be the not all white people guy. but I do feel, but I do feel that the culture is sociopathic. When they talk about white culture, that's a sociopathic culture. I think you're totally right.
Well, I mean, what I'm hearing, correct me if I'm wrong, please. From what I've heard from both of you, I'm hearing the words accountability. I'm hearing the words community. Big thing that I'm hearing, which if you go back to episode 1 of intersectionality and looking through the lens of intersectionality with a lot of this work, competitiveness versus cooperation. I want to actually delve in and evolving and to throw this over to you, perhaps. I apologize. I might be putting you on the spot, but I'm sure I'm not. A little of the education component of our podcast. What I'm also hearing from both you, Ben and Scott, is this concept of race. And frankly, we're dancing around it, but we're not, for those who may be not as informed, race is a construct. Did we want to have a little chat about that? Because that's what I'm hearing in terms of, there might be some people who are thinking, well, what is so wrong about white power if you can have black power or what have you?
Yeah, I mean, it's a social construct, right? It's also a positionality, depending on where you're at in the world. I was thinking about, curious, Ben, as you were describing whiteness, white culture being, sociopathic, there was someone named Dante King who recently spoke at UCSF, and I used to work there as their equity inclusion program manager. And he did a Black History talk, and he talked about whiteness and about it being connected to sociopathic behavior. And he got told that he needed to get off of the stage, and that he was not going to be allowed to come and speak at that institution again because of calling out whiteness in that particular way. Right. So we see it even show up here when it comes to the privilege, right? Like you could say it, and not saying that, people are probably clicking away from the podcast as they heard you say that. That's a potential, but it is a little bit more palatable, right, for you to say it than probably for a Dante King. And what we know, especially here in the United States, is that oftentimes we don't have conversations around culture. We have conversations around race, and what people really mean is white and Black. Even the conversation that we're having right now in the States about DEI. Everyone has already seen that DEI really means Black, probably queer, and disabled, right? It's always these code words in these languages when we're talking about it. So I find it very interesting that when we do bring up race and racism, what's more focused on is the language, right? And Jefferson, we had this conversation recently where you were saying you were having a similar conversation with someone and you were like, fine, let's not call it white fragility or white privilege. Let's just call it purple. And the person was like, I'm still not satisfied with that, right? So we know that racism in itself is a disgusting thing, a thing that we shouldn't be proud of. But at the same time, there's this anchor of privilege and white power that's underlining where there's another part of the culture that are really much connected to it and proud of it. So I find it interesting as well. But yeah, I'll share that part of it. I hope that was educational enough.
It was very educational. That's a very good segue, actually, because it speaks to white fragility, which is connected to white privilege. And I'm actually going to build on that. So I do have this friend, and we were chatting. He's white, important to the story. And a couple of months ago, I said to me, you know what, this concept of white fragility, I mean, if we just named it something else and met people halfway or midway, maybe it'd be more palatable for people, or I'm paraphrasing when I say this. And first off, I said, well, number one, the term was actually coined by a white person, Robin D'Angelo, and it actually describes it perfectly. And I said to him, it's like, well, really, if we're going to look into the nomenclature, so now really what we're doing is putting the focus on the feelings of white people specifically. And now we're having a discussion about the name of something versus actually addressing the real issue. So I said, okay, for argument's sake, let's just call it purple, as Evolve had said. Let's just call it purple and let's have the discussion. And then his response was, well, purple is just a stupid thing to call it. That doesn't make sense. And I said, and this is proving my point. So now we're discussing about what to call it versus discussing the effects of it and its implications in society. So let's have a chat about purple, also known as white fragility. Scott and Ben, go. Like to chime in here.
The one thing I wanted to say, Jefferson, not to cut you off, Scott, as well, is I struggle with this term. So I'm loving that we're having the conversation. But when it first came around and it was written about, I was like, this is just another way to not say like whiteness is toxic and to call it fragile. And then I would be in these trainings and I would start to talk about like the history of race that everyone knows, but mostly in that space. And then white people would start crying and I would be like, no, like I don't want to do this. So I'm just putting that there now because I might have a sassy face in between this conversation, but it has nothing to do with y'all. I just really hate the term, to be transparent.
Well, since we're sharing, to go back to, and no pressure, Ben and Scott, to go back to this concept of white fragility, the shirt, when I purchased this, like I said, I purchased this probably late 90s, early 2000s. I'll be honest, I maybe wore it once. Because I would get looks. There's more in the back that gets into some very specific detail. Again, 2 black guys here in Toronto. Great stuff. In all seriousness, though, I stopped wearing it for a number of years just because of, frankly, I realize now white fragility of how people would look at me and whatnot. And I realized, again, it's code switching. I'm adjusting my behavior for the comfort of white people around me. And considering the current climate right now and with, issues of Black History, I'm like, you know what? Screw it. I'm going black this Black History Month and I'm wearing this walking around. I remember walking around one of our big halls in Toronto and people are like, oh, even black folk are like, what's this about? And I'm like, whatever. And I'm full disclosure. When we had our little pre-interview prior to this, I wore this shirt and Scott and Ben were both, okay, you should wear it for that. Please. Yeah. So no pressure. In all seriousness, though, let's have a chat about white fragility.
So I'm with Evolve on this. Like, I get that you need to package it in this kind of short term that people can remember. And I think white fragility was probably developed for that purpose. But why are we not calling it like weaponized white fragility or sociopathic white fragility? Because it's not actual fragility. Like, it's very intentional. It's very thought out. Go back to the bird watcher in New York City Park. It wasn't like someone was having an emotional breakdown. It was someone was deciding to weaponize their emotions or conjure up emotions. She had to create these emotions. She wasn't even feeling anything. Just like sociopaths you work with, they have to conjure these things up because they've learned if they conjure this up, it's socially acceptable in this way, or they can weaponize it this way. And so, yeah, I struggle with these terms. I also struggle not to get too caught up in conversations about the terms because otherwise you get into the purple conversation again. But yeah, we as white people really struggle, which is part of the quote unquote weaponized fragility, of just seeing shit how it is, like just seeing it and being like, okay, so like if I read your shirt, Jefferson, and I'm like, yep, that's true. Like, I don't have to go any further with that. We could have a discussion if you had something on there that wasn't historically accurate, and we could, share sources or whatever. But why as white people can we not just sit with our discomfort and recognize that other people's safety is so much more important than our discomfort?
Bingo.
Put that quote on a t-shirt, Ben.
Put that on a t-shirt. Yeah, that's... I'm gonna speak on behalf of the fragile, if I may. I'm here for the delicate white people. I actually like white fragility, and I'll say why. Because it's like Ben said. I think Ben and I, I'm getting the impression, are very simpatico in that. I think what's getting us here is that we're just looking at the world with clear eyes, right? And I think Ben nailed it. And that the central problem is that I think. And I don't think this is a white people problem. I think this is a people problem. But we are addicted to comfort. People need to feel emotionally comfortable at all times. And anything that disrupts that emotional comfort is awful and must be put down with a flamethrower. And this is I think that's endemic to everyone, but it's huge for white people. White people cannot bear to be challenged, and that is the privilege, right? And it's like, that is like the minute you say to a white person, and again, like I said, I've been the recipient of this. I've had people say to me, they were like, what's the issue? I remember I used to work with a young Indigenous kid during the time when Canada, a few years back, was celebrating their 150th anniversary. So there was a big swell of patriotism. This was the 150th birthday of Canada. Woohoo, right? Maple leaves everywhere. But this kid that I worked with was like, well, 150 years for you, maybe. But my people have been here in Canada for centuries upon centuries. And I'm like, that is true. You know, we are merely celebrating the political construct of Canada, not the land itself, which has gone on for, you know, and so this kid who I love was wearing a t-shirt with an upside down maple leaf on it. And it said colonization 150, which I thought, like, going back for t-shirts, majestic. I was like, damn, what a great t-shirt.
I love that shirt.
But I said to him, one time, it was like, and it was interesting because I was talking to them, and again, see, even there I slipped. This is a non-binary individual, by the way. So like I slipped and said him. I apologize. It's them. So I'm talking to them one day, and they said to me, you know, about talking about colonization and thing. And I said, yeah, well, you know, I've said many a racist thing, sort of thing. And then suddenly they looked me in the eye and went, well, you are racist. And it was a dagger to my heart. I felt fragile. I was like, you know, and I had that moment of like, you know, that terrible moment that every white person gets when they're challenged and going, well, what do you mean? Why would you call me racist? I'm the good person. I'm helping. How could you do that? You know, and I had to very quickly just clamp that down and turn that off because that's A, it's not productive. And B, it's not true. I'm raised in a racist society. Of course I'm racist. We're all soaking in it. Right. So that's the learning curve that I've been on. That's a white fragility moment right there where I was like, this lovely person just shattered me for a moment. And I had to quickly kind of think, well, what did they mean by that? And why would they say that? And when the thing, and do my own internal reflection. Problem is, not everyone can do that. And so, like you said, white lady tears are definitely a thing. Everybody makes jokes about it, and it's definitely, and I've seen white men tears. So white tears are a problem. And so my advice is always to myself and to everyone else is that when people challenge us for saying or perpetuating racist ideas, we have to own it. We have to stop and say, you know, yeah, you know what? I am feeling fragile. This is white fragility. It's a thing. But like Ben said, though, what you can't do is then flip it around and weaponize it. And that's what everyone does. The minute they feel challenged, it becomes, I can't bear this. I can't bear this feeling, so I must attack you. And that's, yeah.
I'm wondering, Scott and Ben, I'm very fascinated about this. Defensiveness is like a very generational thing too, right? Like that's what really white fragility is, right? It's the defensiveness around being called out about your whiteness, your privilege, the moment. But this is like a thing for our generation. Like I was just talking to my wife about this, that's something I'm working on is like when someone calls me out and calls me in to not immediately go to defensiveness. Right. And I feel like some of that is connected to my professional identity and wanting to be perfect. And it's connected to my relationship to whiteness. So I'm wondering for you all, like, do you remember learning this defensiveness? Do you remember having conversations around race? I know for me in particular, I remember my grandmother, we would go to an ice cream shop that was owned by a white woman and being told to not be too messy, not be too loud. And those were some of the first memories that I remember, like, oh, when we're around white people, we have to show up in a different particular way. And I'm wondering for you all, did you grow up with any of those type of, conversations around when things happen, how you should show up and how you should react to being called white or being called racist?
So I just want to second everything you said, Yval. We used to say we're in polite company was the phrase that my family used to use, which was like, oh, white people around, we got to, mind the P's and Q's.
So early in my career, I came across this model that helped me to see what had happened in my life, but I don't necessarily remember getting educated so directly on it. But it was a hero victim offender model by a guy named Cartman. And it talks about we tend to see ourselves as heroes and we tend to have these expectations. And when those expectations aren't met, we feel like a victim. And when we feel like a victim, we then feel it's justified to punish the person who we see as victimizing us. And so I might look at my relationship, right? And let's say I'm outside cutting the grass in the South Carolina heat, and I'm hot and I'm sweaty, and I come inside and my wife's not throwing me a ticker tape parade, and suddenly I feel victimized because all of my hard work was not recognized. And so suddenly I feel like it's okay to say something smart or to say something unkind. And then if she challenges me on that, I say, well, yeah, but you did an X, Y, Z. And so this hero victim offender cycle, which is huge in domestic violence, sexual violence, sociopathy in general, I realized I'd just become naturally acclimated to it, to see myself a certain way. And that because I see myself this way, I need a certain level of respect or appreciation rather than just leaving that whole cycle behind. And so someone says, hey, Ben, that was racist as hell. And if you don't have any expectations, you can then meet them where they're at and be like, man, tell me more. I'd love to hear more about that. Or if my wife says, man, I feel like I'm doing too much. I don't feel like you're helping enough. Rather than me having to prove anything or defend myself, I can be like, I don't want someone who's suffering or someone who I love to suffer because of my lack of care, my lack of work around the house. And so to me, that model was really helpful in just shifting, taking small steps out of that. I wish my wife was on the podcast now because she could challenge everything I'm saying, but like, Ben, you haven't moved out of that one bit. But it really helped me see that. But I don't know. It's like a fish swimming in water. You don't know what water is. And I think whiteness is so much like that. You grow up in this culture and you have all these ideas that are sociopathic and hero based. And I think in one of the pre-conversations, Scott was talking about Canadians like to see themselves as the good guys. And I was like, it's not just Canadians. Like you look at everything that Americans do, it's under the guise of look how we're caring for people around the world. Like that whole Oval Office meltdown that was had a few days ago was the hero victim offender cycle in action.
It really was. It really was.
Can we actually talk about that for a moment? Because I've been seeing a lot of it now. So again, we're dating the podcast here, but this is right in the time and for the exact date. But the Ukrainian president Zelensky went to the Oval Office to visit the U.S. President Donald Trump and the Vice President J.D. Vance. And I've seen an interesting analysis. Someone apparently did a whole ChatGPT analysis around exactly what you're talking about, Curious Ben, and was like outlined it in terms of the gaslighting, blaming the victim, all of this. And I looked at that, and it actually made me think a bit of your what you talk about on Instagram under it's Ben the Curious is your Instagram, correct?
I don't even know. It's some combination. It's either Curious Ben is the name and Ben the Curious is the handle or the other way around.
Follow Ben, follow Scott. Anyhow, it occurred to me this morning that a lot of what ChatGPT analyzed and what have you been bringing up in terms of this whole concept of the good guy's hero victim. I mean, this is exactly what Black women especially, but women of color, but Black women especially, go through in the workplace all the time. Like it's just and what it made me interesting is suddenly people can, let me be more specific, white people can see it in this case because it's happening to another white man. And I remember thinking, just change all the words from Zelensky to Black woman, and it's the exact same pattern. And I'm thinking, why? How come we can see it when it's happening to a white man, but we can't see it when it happens on the daily to Black women specifically?
But what if they do see it, they just don't care?
You're right.
See, I would argue that not to derail the conversation, but I would argue that the elephant in the room here is capitalism. Because when you talk about workplaces, if you're a mediocre white guy, and I speak on behalf of mediocre white guys, and you've got a talented Black woman, working alongside you, or possibly a rival to promotion or whatever, and she's being marginalized by people, as a human, your instinct might be to like rush in and be like, let's help her and defend her because this kind of bullying is the only thing. But there may be a financial interest in sort of looking at this. And this is where the sociopathy comes from. There's literally a financial interest in going, well, I've got to look out for my wife and my kids and my family. And, that's her problem. Good luck to you. There's an automatic financial structure in place there to prevent solidarity. So I think workplaces are a really fascinating dynamic, but also not necessarily the best one to measure human behavior in, because the workplace dynamic is inherently artificial and competitive, and people like it. It's just that it's an ugly dynamic, and I would argue it's an ugly dynamic that should require us to build out the best in ourselves, but that's not always the case.
Realistic, Scott. For most of us,
And being realistic.
if not half of our lives in the workplace.
Yes.
So we do need to address those. I mean, if we didn't spend our lives in the workplace.
I'm simply saying the problem. You and I work on the solution. DEI is the solution to this. DEI is about finding ways to mitigate everything I just described. So yes, it's like, but I do feel that that is listening. Yeah, you go. It's not a plug. It's like it's funny because it's like the DEI backlash. Jefferson and I have been wrestling with this for 3 years. It's real. It's awful. It's but it's inherently based on this idea that capitalism is like crabs in a bucket. And it doesn't have to be. We know that you're more profitable when you work together. We know that, like, I've had amazing work relationships with Black women who I have helped them. They have helped me. I'm happy to say that the last 2 jobs that I left, I made sure that a talented woman of color replaced me when I left those jobs. It's like, there's a way to make this work, but I'm just saying that capitalism is sort of the like you said, the water we're all swimming in that we can't recognize for being the threat that it is.
Yeah, I love that you brought that in, Scott, because when we do think about that conversation that happened in the Oval Office, that is their workplace, right? Like that is their workplace, right? The Oval Office, come into my office, let's have this conversation publicly. But it also was connected to capitalism, because he was saying, we gave you all of this money. We helped you. What have you done for us lately? So it's right. It was artificial in that moment. And that's the reason why I believe that the president of Ukraine showed up in that particular way and was humble, right? Where if the cameras weren't on, he might have pushed back a little bit more. And that's the same thing that can happen for Black women, non-binary folks in the workplace. Oftentimes when we are put into positions where we're having conversations about our positionality or our behavior, it's put in a public place on purpose in order to show everyone in the workplace, i.e. everyone in America, everyone in the world, how to behave and how not to behave, right? And it's really a control mechanism. So I love that y'all brought that into the conversation, because I think that it's connected to that hero, but it's also connected to the bully, which is another part of it that people actually appreciate and show glamour towards, like, oh, he's sticking it to him. But it's always connected to white men being able to be that bully. And that's when it's appropriate. If it's a Black woman or a non-binary person, you're the angry Black person in the room, and then you don't hold as much privilege and as much connection to it.
So I was fascinated by the level of emotional behavior in that room. That if anyone else other than a white male had displayed, they would be called hysterical, what have you. There was a quote that I saw, and I didn't hear the quote. I just saw it cited somewhere that said, Zelensky said to J.D. Vance, the volume of your voice is going up, but not the logic of your argument. And it's this thing that white males do where they can act as emotional as they like, typically angry because they refuse to touch on hurt and fear, the 2 kind of ingredients of anger. And yet the minute anyone has an emotional reaction to their emotion, they're considered the problem. And so I love what Evolve's saying about just this culture of bullying. And Scott, when you were talking about kind of the workplace being an artificial environment, I really challenge that, because so many Americans see the whole identity as what they do for work. And when you meet them and say, hey, my name's Ben, the first thing they're going to say is, what do you do? Well, I spend time with my kids, I drink some beer, and I love walking around town. And they're not going to get that, because for them, what they're trying to say is, what value do you have in this world? What are you producing? And so for me, I don't see the workplace. Yeah, I see the workplace not as an artificial environment, but as the ultimate way to often view how white people in America behave. And that's why my wife and I tend to focus a lot on workplaces and care for workplaces, because this is where you see these behaviors really get practiced and perfected and passed on to the next generation.
Yeah.
Exactly. And I think it's time we should wrap things up. This has been a lovely, lovely conversation. Actually, a very enlightening conversation, more than lovely, I would say. I could go on forever about this. Again, I've been taking a few notes here. Thank you both, Ben and Scott. A few things I want to thoughts I'd like to leave before we'll have Evolve wrap up. Again, I'm hearing a lot about intersectionality and looking through that lens. I think that's very important. That's something I know Evolve and I both champion and discuss. That was our very first podcast episode, was intersectionality. So if you do not understand that concept, scroll up and take a look for that episode. I'm hearing accountability. I'm hearing community. Ben, I have to thank you I learned quite a bit today. Thank you for your curiosity. But this whole concept of sociopathy, am I pronouncing that correctly?
Mm-hmm. Sociopathy.
Thank you.
Either or.
Competitiveness versus cooperation, weaponized fragility, safety versus discomfort. I always viewed that as the good guys and that hero victim model. And defensiveness. But thank you for that. That's something that I've taken away from this conversation. I think we're may have to do another one of these episodes at another point, because I think we're just scratching the surface here. What are your thoughts, Evolve?
I totally agree. If I learned anything, it's read a damn book. Shouts out to that quote. And that's what's so amazing about this work, right? Like, people have been doing this, y'all. And we talked about this in one of our episodes for years. There's so much literature. There's so many books. There's so many YouTubes. You probably will see our podcast and a bunch of other DEI related podcasts populate. So if anything, educate yourself, go follow our guests. And, I love what Ben spoke about, really having the capacity to say, tell me more about that. I think that that's something that we all can lean into when we feel defensive. And perhaps we'll bring on my wife eventually, and, your wife, Ben, to talk a little bit about, connecting this deeper to the divine feminine and supporting Black women in this work. But I'm really excited about it.
Thank you all. And thank you both for joining us today.